There's a moment in chess when a player makes a move that looks aggressive but is actually a trap, and the opponent doesn't realize they've lost until 3 moves later. That is precisely what just happened in the Middle East. While American networks framed Iran's posture as desperation, as the last gasp of a cornered regime, something far more calculated was unfolding beneath the surface. The United States, the most militarily powerful nation in human history, has been maneuvered into a position where every option available to it is either costly, contradictory, or counterproductive. And the two nations watching this most carefully, China and Russia, aren't just observing. They're taking notes, adjusting timelines, and quietly celebrating a strategic gift they didn't even have to engineer themselves. To understand how America arrived at this dead end, we have to go back further than the headlines suggest. The architecture of this trap was not built overnight. It was constructed brick by brick over decades of American foreign policy that consistently mistook military dominance for strategic wisdom. When you have the most powerful hammer in the world, every problem begins to look like a nail. And that cognitive bias, that reflex toward force, is precisely the vulnerability that adversaries have learned to exploit. Iran, more than almost any other state actor in the world, has studied this American reflex with the patience of a clinical researcher. They have watched how the United States responds to provocation, how it escalates, how its domestic politics become entangled with its foreign commitments, and how it struggles to exit conflicts it was never designed to win. What we are watching right now is the harvest of that study. Iran did not need to defeat America militarily. That was never the goal. The goal was far more elegant and far more devastating. To make the cost of confrontation so unpredictable, so economically draining, and so politically toxic inside the United States that Washington finds itself paralyzed. And here is the critical realization I want you to hold in mind, because we will come back to it fully in the final part of this conversation. The paralysis itself is the victory. We will unpack exactly what that means and why it changes everything about how you should understand the next 12 months of American foreign policy. But to understand why this matters, we have to look at what Iran has actually built over the past 2 decades. While American strategists were focused on Iran's nuclear program, which is a real concern to be clear, they consistently underestimated the parallel infrastructure Iran was constructing across the region. The network that includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi movement in Yemen, various militia structures in Iraq, and the web of influence extending into Syria. This is not a collection of proxy armies in the traditional Cold War sense. That framing is actually a trap in itself, because it implies Iran is remote controlling these groups like pieces on a game board. The reality is considerably more sophisticated. What Iran built is a coalition of shared interests, where local actors have their own genuine motivations that happen to align structurally with Iranian strategic objectives. This is far harder to dismantle than a simple command and control hierarchy, because you cannot simply cut off the head and watch the body collapse. The Houthis are perhaps the most vivid illustration of this. Here is a movement operating from one of the poorest countries on earth, launching attacks that are forcing the United States Navy to burn through extraordinarily expensive missile interceptors to stop relatively cheap drones and ballistic missiles. The economic mathematics of this exchange are staggering, and I want you to sit with that for a moment. When a $2,000 drone requires a $2 million intercept, and that exchange happens dozens of times, the financial attrition is not symbolic, it is strategic. The United States defense industrial base, which is already strained, is being asked to sustain a rate of expenditure that serves no clear political objective. There is no off-ramp, there is no defined victory condition, and there is no domestic political consensus about what success even looks like. So I want to ask you directly, and I genuinely want to hear your perspective in the comments. What does American victory in the Red Sea actually look like? Because I have studied this carefully and I cannot find a coherent answer from Washington. Now, China and Russia enter this picture not as coordinators of Iranian strategy, although coordination does exist at certain levels, but as beneficiaries of a dynamic that is draining American attention, resources, and credibility simultaneously. Russia, which has been managing Western pressure over Ukraine and sanctions for over 2 years now, watches American military assets pivot toward the Middle East and understands that the bandwidth of the American strategic establishment is finite. Every carrier group in the Persian Gulf region is a carrier group that is not in the Western Pacific. Every political conversation consumed by Iranian nuclear negotiations or Red Sea shipping security is a conversation that is not being had about Taiwan, about the South China Sea, about the long-term restructuring of the global economic order, Russia doesn't need to do anything dramatic. It simply needs to endure to maintain the pressure in Ukraine at manageable cost and allow the dispersion of American strategic focus to do its work. China's calculus is even more cold-blooded and, I would argue, even more sophisticated. Beijing has watched the United States respond to the post-October 7th crisis with a combination of unconditional military and diplomatic support for Israel, while simultaneously claiming to advocate for Palestinian civilian protection. The contradiction between those two positions has not gone unnoticed in the global South. In country after country across Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East itself, the perception of American moral authority, which was always the soft power foundation of American global influence, has taken serious damage. China, which presents itself as a non-interventionist power that respects sovereignty, has seized this moment with remarkable agility. The diplomatic breakthrough that China brokered between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2023 was a preview of Beijing's intentions. It signaled to the entire region that there is an alternative patron available, one that does not come with lectures about democracy, does not require military basing rights, and does not generate the kind of blowback that American engagement consistently produces. That signal has been received, and it is being acted upon. But to understand why this matters at the deepest level, we have to look at what American strategic paralysis actually costs beyond the immediate military and economic dimensions. There is a subtler damage being done, and it operates at the level of institutional credibility. When a great power repeatedly finds itself in situations where it cannot translate military superiority into political outcomes, Vietnam being the defining historical example, Iraq and Afghanistan being the more recent ones, something fundamental begins to erode. Allies begin to hedge their bets, partners begin to explore alternative arrangements, adversaries begin to probe more aggressively because the cost-benefit calculation of challenging American power has shifted. This is not a process that happens all at once. It happens gradually, then suddenly. And I would argue, and again, I want your honest assessment in the comments because this is a genuine open question, that we are currently somewhere in the gradual phase, approaching the inflection point where gradually becomes suddenly. The nuclear dimension of the Iran situation adds another layer of complexity that Washington has struggled to process honestly. The argument for American and Israeli military action against Iranian nuclear facilities rests on the premise that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable. But the practical reality is that military strikes, even highly sophisticated ones, would at most delay the Iranian program, not eliminate it. And the consequences of such strikes, Iranian retaliation against Gulf oil infrastructure, the closure or mining of the Strait of Hormuz, the mobilization of the entire regional network that Iran has built, would generate an energy price shock of a magnitude that would ripple through every economy on Earth. The countries that would suffer most from a global oil supply disruption are not Russia and Iran. They are the developing world nations whose populations are already under severe economic stress. And the political consequences of that suffering would land, in significant measure, on the United States diplomatically. What Iran has therefore constructed is essentially a deterrence architecture that does not require nuclear weapons to function. The threat of what would follow military action against Iran is itself the deterrent. This is a remarkable strategic achievement, and I think it deserves to be acknowledged with analytical honesty, regardless of how one feels about the Iranian government or its ideology. The revolutionary state that Jimmy Carter watched emerge from the chaos of 1979 has, over 4.5 decades, built a strategic position that has checkmates some of the most experienced military and diplomatic minds in the world. That is not a minor accomplishment. That is the product of institutional learning, strategic patience, and a willingness to absorb enormous suffering. Sanctions, assassinations of nuclear scientists, cyber attacks, proxy wars, without capitulating. Now I want to return to that critical realization I mentioned at the beginning, because this is where the analysis becomes genuinely important for understanding what comes next. The paralysis itself is the victory. Here is what that means in full. The United States government is currently caught between several irreconcilable political commitments. It is committed to Israel's security, including Israel's stated objective of preventing a nuclear Iran. It is committed to freedom of navigation in international waters, including the Red Sea. It is committed to the security of Gulf Arab partners, and it is simultaneously attempting to signal to the broader international community that it respects the sovereignty of nations and seeks diplomatic solutions. These commitments are not compatible with each other in the current environment. Honoring one consistently means compromising another, and the resulting policy incoherence, the mixed signals, the pauses in weapons deliveries followed by resumptions, the UN vetoes followed by abstentions, has created a situation where no one, not allies, not adversaries, not neutral observers, can predict what America will do next with any confidence. And here is the profound geopolitical consequence of that unpredictability. It is not, as some in Washington believe, a form of strategic ambiguity that keeps adversaries off balance. It is instead read globally as a sign of a power that has lost its internal coherence. A great power that cannot resolve its own policy contradictions is a power in transition, and when great powers are in transition, the international system reorganizes itself around that reality. We are watching that reorganization happen in real time. The BRICS expansion, the conversations about alternative reserve currency arrangements, the Chinese yuan being used in increasing volumes for trade settlement, the military cooperation agreements being signed between countries that would have been unthinkable partners a decade ago, all of these are symptoms of a world that is hedging against American predictability. Does this mean America is finished as a global power? I want to be analytically precise here, because this is where commentary often becomes either panicked or dismissive, and neither serves clear thinking. The United States retains extraordinary advantages: its technology base, its financial systems depth, its military capacity, its alliance network, its demographic dynamism compared to China and Russia. These are real, they are not illusions. But advantages are not the same as outcomes. The question is not whether America is powerful. The question is whether American strategic culture, at this particular moment in history, is capable of converting that power into durable influence. And what the Iran situation reveals, what the trap that has been sprung reveals, is that the answer to that question is genuinely uncertain in a way that it was not 20 years ago. What would strategic wisdom look like in this environment? I'll offer a framework, not a prescription, because I think the audience watching this is sophisticated enough to develop their own conclusions. Strategic wisdom would begin with an honest inventory of which commitments are genuinely vital to American national interest and which are the product of historical inertia, domestic political lobbying, or ideological reflex. It would recognize that credibility is not built by honoring every commitment regardless of context. It is built by making clear-eyed decisions about where and how to apply power most effectively. It would understand that China and Russia are not 10 feet tall, that they have their own profound structural vulnerabilities, and that a patient, strategically coherent America could navigate this transition period from a position of relative strength rather than reactive exhaustion. But getting from here to there requires a quality of political leadership and institutional self-reflection that, at this moment, does not appear to be available. And that gap between what is needed and what is present is perhaps the most consequential strategic fact of our time. So I ask you this, and I mean it as a genuine question rather than a rhetorical device: what would it take for American strategic culture to recalibrate? Not the government, not the think tanks, but the culture itself, the assumptions that flow through the institutions, the reflexes that get activated when the situation demands something other than force. Because ultimately, the trap Iran has set is not just a trap for American foreign policy, it is a mirror, and what it reflects back is a question that the most powerful nation in human history has not yet found the courage to ask itself honestly: